First Amendment freedoms, and government transparency. This is the foundation to a healthy democracy. Welcome to the NEFAC Report, where we discuss your right to free speech, freedom of the press, and an open, accountable government. I'm Alexandra Tabalone, production manager for the NEFAC Report and part of a student team here at Roger Williams University, working in partnership with the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thanks for joining us. On this episode, we speak to investigative reporter Tim White about encrypted police scanners and how this growing practice is making it difficult for communities in Rhode Island to stay informed. Later in the show, we'll speak with journalist Norah Hogan about a tragedy in Bath, Maine, and how police there are keeping certain details about the investigation a secret. Here's NEFAC Executive Director Justin Silverman and Tim White at WPRI in Providence.
Thank you, Tim, for being here. Let's jump right into it. We've got an issue in the city of Cranston, Rhode Island. Police there are now encrypting their scanners.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. How the police department uses a scanner is, I think, how everybody understands its use. Somebody calls the police department seeking help, and police departments, all of them have multiple channels and they have multiple purposes. So primarily, police department's channel one is where those routine calls go out. When we talk about scanners being like they are in Cranston being encrypted, it's important to understand we're generally talking about the concern over that channel one, those routine calls or that initial call that might come in. Anybody that's been in a newsroom has heard them. You go to any in TV an assignment desk, and newspapers are called a city desk, and they have a row of scanners, and they're listening to law enforcement and fire departments across the region in which they cover to hear if there's anything that might be newsworthy or something the public should know about. Also, photojournalists and videographers at television stations have them in their cars. So if they are in Cranston, out on assignment on another story, and all of a sudden a call comes in for a really bad fire at a church, they know it's happening. They can get down there. That's an important story to cover for that community. And honestly, when you choke that off, then that actually places more of a burden in many ways on the dispatchers, because when we don't get that information over those feeds, Justin, then we have to call to get that information. And the last thing dispatchers want to do is to, in the heat of the moment, have to tell someone from the news media or the public what is going on. And I would just also add, look, the news media plays a critical role in public safety itself. So obviously our job is to inform the public, and we can tell people in real time to avoid an area because there's a shooting going on, or avoid an area because there's this really bad fire and it has shut down an entire block, instead of waiting for that press release to come out from the fire department, to come out from the Cranston Police Department when they have time to put it out there. There is a law enforcement interest in us being able to inform the public what we can about what's going on, and we do that through being able to listen to these scanners.
All right, so I'm going to have you speak more to those interests in a moment, but first, explain to me why there's now a demand to encrypt these scanners that have been in use for decades. Newsrooms throughout the years have been using these scanners. Why are we now seeing cities like Cranston say, no longer, we're going to encrypt all of our communications?
What they will tell you is it is for officer safety. They don't want the bad guys listening in on, if they're moving in on a hostage situation. And they want to make sure that they can get into that location safely without the person on the inside, the bad actor, being able to listen in on their movements. That's a very compelling argument. That being said, turning off the spigot is not the answer and not the solution to that argument. As I told you early on, there's channel one. That's wide open to listen to. When that situation moves into something in which police officers need to be protected, they can go to encrypted channels. There are options for them to do that.
What is your concern then, as a member of the press, with having that channel encrypted when you can just go to the spokesperson for the police department, go to the police chief, make a public records request for the transcripts of those calls after the fact? Why not just pursue those avenues?
Because again, you're going through information that could be filtered. And if there is something that the agency doesn't want you to know about, then they're going to withhold that information. And even if it is something that would fall under a state or a federal public records law, Justin, we have seen documents and information be withheld because exemptions are so broadly written. So it is very important to get information in real time so we can inform the public about what is going on in their community. It's not a small thing. I just want to stress that by encrypting these police radio scanners, that's a big deal. You are closing off a big pipe of information, not only to journalists, news medias, newsrooms, but to the public.
Yeah, and it's for that reason that NEFAC, the Rhode Island Broadcasters Association, and a number of newsrooms have been pushing back against this policy in Cranston. And one of the reasons we've been doing so is we fear that with every town that takes on this practice, it's just going to make it easier for other towns to say, well, they're doing it, we should as well, let's encrypt our channels. And now all of a sudden you have this trend of cities and towns turning off that communication that not only journalists like you rely on, but other members of the public. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit for us, Tim. Is this purely a journalism issue?
It isn't. The public pays the price when this happens. And there are hobbyists that just like to listen to police scanners. It's something that they enjoy. They want to know what's going on in their community. And this is a constant news feed, if you will, of what is happening there. And I would also make the argument for both the news media and the public that the vast majority of the information that is coming through that scanner is showing law enforcement doing good work and showing law enforcement serving the public. So I think that police agencies should be very mindful of that if you turn on a newscast, the vast majority of our stories are about cops catching bad guys. They just are. And very few of them are about the negative entanglements with law enforcement. When you close off access to this information, there are going to be fewer of those stories, I promise.
Yeah, and I imagine if you keep these channels open and unencrypted, it would also make the lives of these police departments easier, because then there's not going to be such a clamoring for information. That communication is going to exist. Anytime there's some news event involving police, you're not going to have as many journalists aggressively seeking that information because it's already being provided through the channel. So isn't there some self-interest here on behalf of the police departments to keep these lines open just for logistical reasons?
Yes, the scenario I gave before about there's an incident going on, we can hear it, we are telling the public to avoid that area. That's a service to the police department, I would argue. But also, if we are closed off to the real-time information that these scanner frequencies provide, the information is going to get to us in other ways, and it's going to be confused and jumbled. So if somebody, a resident of a community, hears, firecrackers going off, they call it, oh, there's a shooting down on Smith Street, and then we are calling the dispatcher, we're dispatching our news crews to go and cover something that was nothing of interest. Where if we hear on the scanners, the police officers responded, there were some kids with some fireworks. And I know this sounds like a silly example. These are real examples. This happens all the time. If you just sit in a newsroom, and Justin, I know you've been in them, and you hear the vast majority of scanner traffic, it's a lot about eliminating stuff that is really not newsworthy and not something the public needs to worry about. When that goes away, we lose that ability, and then we're going to have to just rely more and more on the people within those departments to give us that information. And that's a burden on them.
Well, hopefully this scenario can be prevented. As I mentioned, NEFAC, Rhode Island Broadcasters Association, newsrooms pushing back against this policy in Cranston, and will continue to do so there as well as anywhere else the communication over scanners is at risk of being encrypted. With that, thank you, Tim, for taking the time to walk us through these issues and really explain to us why it's important that these channels remain unencrypted, not just for journalists, but for all communities, for the sake of having accurate, timely information about what's going on in their neighborhoods.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks to NEFAC for recognizing this as an important issue.
Hey, this is Alexandra again. If you enjoyed the conversation between Justin and Tim, please check out our show notes. A link is provided wherever you're listening to this podcast. These notes include additional information about police scanner encryption and why this is a growing concern for communities throughout New England. Also, check out the many programs offered by NEFAC. With classes on open government and quick-hit lessons on journalism and the First Amendment, NEFAC plays host every month to a growing audience of reporters, editors, and other curious community members. You can find a listing of all events, both online and in person, at nefac.org. Join us. Now, let's hear from a reporter in Maine who is covering a tragedy in the town of Bath. Police there are keeping key details about the investigation a secret for reasons you might not expect. Here's Justin with Norah Hogan.
Bath, Maine, horrible situation that occurred there. What is the tragedy that unfolded?
This was back in October of 2024. It happened on a Sunday, I remember, because I was working the anchor desk that morning. There was a shelter-in-place order. And as is usually the case, we have very little information from police in that moment. We make the decision to send a crew there as soon as we can because we're hearing from neighbors. They're scared, they're concerned, they don't know what's happening. Huge presence on the street. They're asking people to stay inside their homes. By the time the day is out, we learn that there was some sort of homicide. It becomes public knowledge relatively quickly that it was a domestic violence situation. A man killed both his wife and his adult daughter at that home in Bath. So the next day, it's Monday, we have more resources. I'm reporting. We have two people on this story at this point. And I called up police. I'm trying to find information about whether police had made any other calls to that home, because frequently, especially with domestic violence, we see that there had been some police activity before it escalates to something like this. So at that time, I was able to use police logs to confirm that police had been to that same home where the homicides took place about 2 weeks prior. We know that they made 2 visits to the house, both on the same day, and in police logs, it typically says what they were called there for, which isn't necessarily the ultimate thing that gets written up in the report. I mean, sometimes the person who calls police is giving very limited information. Police investigate, they find that that wasn't really what happened. But these were logged as family fights, and one was a family fight and assault with a knife. So we don't know if any of that was the full story. We don't really know any details. We just know they were there. So I immediately asked police for the police reports from those 2 visits, not even asking for the police report from the murders. They denied that request because it's still under investigation. Of course, this is the day after the homicide, so everything is unfolding. They're still trying to get more information, but we report on the fact that police made those calls to the house.
All right, so let's go back a few steps, particularly for those that aren't familiar with Maine's Freedom of Access Act and the ability of reporters and really all of us, members of the public, to get access to information by making public records requests. In your role as a reporter, how do you typically go about getting these police logs, these police reports, and how often do you run into any kind of challenge getting those documents?
Pretty much there's a challenge every single time because we're reacting on the day of or the day after these incidents. Usually myself as an investigative reporter, my first question is, okay, what happened here? So we asked for frequently the police records associated with the crime, the event, and then any related police records if there were previous calls involving those people or involving the location. I mean, you can make a public information request in any fashion. And pretty much always we hear that they can't give it to us yet because it's still under investigation.
And just as a point of context for everyone listening, this ongoing police investigation, this is an exemption to the Maine public records law, but it's common within most, if not all states. The purpose being, if police departments, they would argue, release certain information, it might somehow jeopardize their investigation or put the case that they're working on in risk. Certainly, I've seen in my experience, there are some legitimate reasons why this exemption would be cited. I've also found that across the board, not just in Maine, but across the board in other states as well, this is one of the most abused exemptions to public record laws. So with that said, let's go back to the situation in Bath. You have this murder that occurred. You're looking for information about how the police responded to this household in the days leading up to this murder.
Did the police department give you any information at all, or did they just tell you right out of the gate, no, we're not giving you those police reports that you're requesting?
These are difficult situations, and it's times it can feel like the press and police are at odds with one another. The police chief in Bath has been nothing but polite and responsive. So although they've made it very difficult to get information, at least it's been a respectful back and forth. So the day after the homicides occurred, he was at least able to say, correct, these police calls happened, there were no arrests made. So at least we had that amount of information confirmed at the time. And he didn't outright deny the records request, period. At that time, he said, this is an ongoing investigation. So I continued to follow up as we get further from this event. Eventually, they moved to also citing these privacy concerns because the investigation today is still ongoing, technically, because the autopsies haven't been completed. But they're moving to this privacy concern as the primary reason why they're not giving us these records at this point.
Let's talk about that for a little bit. So you've got this ongoing police investigation, but now you also have this argument that the police are using. Well, in addition to that, you also have some privacy interests here, presumably of the deceased, those that were killed in this incident. Have you ever come across a situation where that type of argument is being made to withhold a police report?
Not in its entirety. I think I've come up against that with domestic violence calls in general. And I think privacy interests exist for all the parties in that case, right? But they're especially concerned about hurting the privacy of victims. So I've heard that as an exemption previously. I've been able to get records with redactions. I've never seen it in this sort of situation.
What options do you have in a situation like this, where you have all of this information being withheld, vital information that's in the public's interest? What do we do?
Yeah, so initially, once the request was denied, I used all the tools at my disposal, which meant reaching out to you at NEFAC and getting your input, combing through the actual law that we have, the Freedom of Access Act here in Maine, to see if they were perhaps missing something. I mean, the best way we can advocate for ourselves is to check the language of the law ourselves and with people who are available to help us do that. We ended up reaching out to our lawyers at Hearst as well. And we're lucky. We're a local news station, but we're owned by a big national media company. So we're lucky to have lawyers in-house. And one of our attorneys, Diego, was able to intervene on our behalf and eventually got connected with the attorney who's representing the Bath Police Department. Not every media organization has those resources, which is something that I think we need to remain focused on, because some of these small newspapers, as some of these newspapers close, even before that, they're struggling financially. Not everyone has the same legal resources, and it's tough. And at least it helps to have someone like NEFAC who can also help. But without that, you're just one person or one team trying to get this done. And once our attorney intervened, we were able to get records, but they were heavily redacted. But prior to that, it was a hard line no. And so obviously pushing eventually resulted in something more.
Is there any indication as to when or if you'll get unredacted versions of those documents?
Well, when I reached back out for comment, I believe it was a couple of days before I ran the story. Obviously, I'd been in touch with the police chief, but here's one more opportunity. This is the scope of the story that we're going to be running. Any other comments? And at that time, he essentially said that they won't be lifting these redactions without a court order. And they're protecting themselves too. I mean, we see this a lot. I don't think it necessarily comes from a bad place. I mean, there are obviously bad actors, but sometimes these departments are worried about a lawsuit themselves. And I think they can be overly cautious as a result. So that's the sense that we're getting. A court order would protect them. They would be able to release the records without concern about any backlash for them personally.
So fortunately, you were able to get some additional information, not everything you wanted. Unfortunately, we're in this all too common situation where in order to get records that we are entitled to under the law, we ultimately have to go to court. And even some of the largest newsrooms with the resources aren't able to do that. Never mind the small nonprofits, independent journalists, and others that are fighting for information every single day. Not many, if any of them, have the time and resources to bring these cases to court. We at NEFAC are working on ways to bring more cases and to make sure that this information gets out to the public and to provide additional support to journalists like you. And in the meantime, Norah, I just want to thank you for all of your work and continuing to fight for all of this information and everything you do to keep our communities informed.
Thank you so much, Justin. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening to the NEFAC Report. Join us next time when we'll be speaking with attorney Jonathan Albano about reporter confidentiality protections in Massachusetts. Here's a preview.
So the situation now is that in Massachusetts, judges will get mad at me for this, but it can really depend on the judge.
And former NEFAC legal fellow Lindsay Vickers about Connecticut public record laws.
There was one record that I requested and they were like, that doesn't exist for us. And I was like, okay, cool. What do you mean?
This program is produced by the New England First Amendment Coalition in partnership with Roger Williams University's Communities of Hope, under the guidance of Professor Bernardo Mata. Huge shout out to our student team, David Peters and Matthew Downey for the editing, Brianna Frysora for promotion, Anna Pellegrini for the program logos, Will Feingold for music, Sarah Price for the show notes, and Lex Benson Amoranti for production assistance. We'll see you next time.